me a second. If not, then I may have the wrong stream key, in which case we're on someone else's channel.
Nope, just live.
Oh, we are?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, okay. All right, so welcome to Into the Nexus, the third episode. Today, Chief Sarkhan and I will be focusing on dungeons, the two dungeons, Stormtalon's Lair, as well as Ruins of Kel-Vareth. My buddy here, Chief Sarkhan, is the man, help representing both Wildstar fans and MMORPG.com. Say hello, my friend.
Hello, folks. Nice to see you again.
Absolutely. We're gonna have a good time today. We're going to be discussing over the basics of each dungeon, how to run through dungeons in general, what to look for, what you should probably take with you, just based upon what you're going to be fighting and what you have to be looking forward to in terms of telegraphs and just the general mechanics of each dungeon. So today we're going to start off with Stormtalon's Lair, and again, for just at the beginning, just give our general impressions of the dungeon and what we may perceive to be, if it's fair enough, if it's hard enough, or if it could be harder, or how the mechanics are. So Chief, I want you to give me just a brief description of your overall experience so far and what you think on STL.
Stormtalon Lair, I love the dungeon. I love its the shape and simplicity of it as far as the flow. But the difficulty itself is spot on. I mean, it's tough, but not too tough for basically a first dungeon. Being that you can only walk in it at 17, but only can queue for it at 20, and it's your first real dungeon. Well, you got the Ruins of Kel-Vareth also, but, it's spot on and where it needs to be for difficulty. It's going to wipe a group if you're not prepared, but you're going to be able to get through it with not really too much problems if you communicate. And I think that's the key in all the dungeons is communication. Are you talking about what needs to be done, or are you doing the whole Wild Zerg philosophy and, I don't need to know who you are, let's just So.
Well, I mean, I think that's the biggest thing, honestly, and more so in this game than in the other. At least from my experience, communication is just huge, especially when you're dealing with telegraphs from not only the enemy but your ally, especially if you're dealing with a mid-ranged healer such as a medic. You can't just fight at max range if you're an Esper or a Spellsinger, or even, to a certain degree, engineer. You got to kind of stay within it, as well as staying sort of on top of the tank, or at least on the opposite side of the tank, so you're not getting cleaved down. Because again, if you're outside of that range and you're still getting hit by residual damage, honestly, as a healer, I mean, I don't play a healer, but I can imagine I would sacrifice my DPS if they're not smart enough to stay within range of my heals. I mean, that's sort of the basic concept of that, on top of the enemy's telegraphs. So the dungeon is difficult. It can wipe you if you're not careful. I honestly hope they make it more difficult. I don't think it's difficult enough. I mean, maybe because I've run it so many times. That could be it. What do you think?
Well, and I think that's the key is it is difficult enough for the average player. Once you've ran it a number of times and you kind of know the tricks and the nuances, what side to run down if you want to skip mobs, that type of thing, it starts to become simple. And I think it needs to become simple to a certain degree. And we have veteran dungeons for you to come back if you really want to punish yourself in the same dungeon.
Punish.
And you got to keep in mind that after you've ran it 4 or 5 times, you're almost leveled to the point where you just need to move on anyway, unless you're scaling down to help somebody. So, yeah, it gets really easy at a point, but it also depends if you're pugging or you're running with your buddies
at the
same time. Because like I was tanking an adventure last night, and I'm a stalker. You would be amazed at how many people that do not understand how stalkers tank. So it made my job a whole lot harder. Just like you were talking about the medic and the Spellslingers, and the Espers being in the wrong place. The same thing goes with tanking as a stalker and people opening up before I've really gotten things established as a tank. And with telegraphs, that can sometimes take a second for me to not eat a telegraph just to get the aggro going. But no, let's open up. Let's blow everything up, because by this time the warrior's gotten it, because he's got, his shouts or whatever they have. I don't play a warrior, so I don't know. But you know what I'm saying? It's different. Each class composition is different, and the group composition changes, which makes the dungeons sometimes seem super easy, sometimes super difficult. But the biggest thing I like about the dungeons that most people, once they've run them a couple times, don't pay attention to is the side stuff. You know, Storm Talon's got the little ledges that you can get up to that, unfortunately, a lot of times in pubs, they want to skip that. But if you do it, you can open up a little store to do a little repair and stuff. And most people miss those little nuances because they just want to get the gold and get out of there, you know?
Right.
So.
Well, that's especially true if you're running into the veteran modes and you're trying to get silver just to get it tuned, you know? And then you're sometimes, in most cases, actually in all cases from what I've seen, you're running against the clock. You're running against the fact that you guys can't die because if you do, the reward goes down. And then people tend to rush and not, take a second to look back and say, wow, I can skip these mobs. I can just go on the ledge over here, like you said, and just skip this group, therefore cutting my time by a couple minutes, which would save me. It's good. But that, it's like you said, at the end of the day, these are, in essence, beginner dungeons. They introduce you to the concept of the telegraph system, but in sort of like a pretty severe degree because it is difficult if you haven't done it before. It's even more difficult if you're running with a pug. And even if you're experienced, if you're running with a pug, holy crap, there's only so much a single player can do, right? So if they don't know what they're doing, wipe to what you consider would be easy to someone who's never actually done it or has done it maybe once would obviously not to be considered as easy. So it's something that, that I think, and especially in a game like this where they kind of broke the mold from it and it's not your standard game. There's no telegraphs in any other game. There's no, hey, look, there's red stuff on the floor. I should probably not stay in that. I mean, you have the concept of staying out of the fire, and I get that, but it's more pronounced here with the obviousness of, the red stuff on the ground. So not many people realize that. In some cases, people aren't reacting fast enough to get out of that stuff. Because some of these telegraphs, if you don't react within literally a second, you're going to get hit. And it's going to hurt. And again, your healer has to dictate, do I sacrifice a little damage for my tank who may or may not die? Or do I sacrifice one of my DPSs who's probably going to die? So it's a toss-up. And again, that's especially as a tank that you play and especially as a healer that other people play, the role is so much more difficult than it is just for some single DPS like myself. So yeah.
Well, yeah, and Storm Talon is a prime example to where it's not just about the bosses either. I mean, you go into the one room and it's tornadoes all over the place, and if you're not paying attention to the environmental, plus what the boss is getting ready to do, you could blow the fight before you even really get started. Especially if you're going for a gold, because the challenge or the achievement is, get to the boss without getting hit by these waves of things coming at you, and you have to repeat it like 3 times if you're slow on damage, only 2 times if your team's pretty good at damage. But it's not just about just a telegraph from a boss or just a telegraph from your teammates. You got to pay attention to the entire room, and that's especially important when they start getting up into senior dungeons and raids where you have parts of your environment that just disappear. Stand in the wrong spot, you're dead. There's no stand on the sidelines and just plink away.
Yeah, there's no hanging out here.
Yeah.
You have to take responsibility for yourself in this game. It's not as pronounced as, like, again, I come from Guild Wars 2 to where there's no roles. It's not as pronounced there, but you still have to take care of yourself to some degree. You can't rely on your tank and your healer to do everything for you. They can't just say, get out of the red stuff, They can't. It's like leading a horse to water and making them drink. You can't do that. You have to actively do it yourself. So it's a toss-up, like I said. And one of the things I've encountered anytime I've ever been pugging is if you're pugging up a dungeon and someone in there tells you specifically, look, I've never done this dungeon before, tell them what the hell to do. Tell them what they need to do over the course of the dungeon versus someone who doesn't speak up. Now you're under the assumption that they know what they're doing, right? But then they keep screwing up over and over and over. I mean, what do you expect? So it's rough, and I would say this in every single time is run with a dedicated group because a pug will give you a significant headache at the end of the day. I'm sure you've experienced that just as much as anybody else, Chief.
Well, and to add to that, be clear about what your objective is if you're coming into the dungeon. If you're running it for the 20th time because you're really only after an achievement, make sure the party's on board with you trying to achieve that when you come in, especially if it's a pug, Do you want to do the alternate content because you're on the quest and it's your first time through? You may know what you're supposed to be doing because you looked it up. You've done your research. But you need to do the alternate, hey, I have the quest. You need to say that the moment you get in there. Can you please help make sure I get it done? Because there are going to be those groups that just want to do the bare minimum, get through, kill the bosses, and go for it. You know, Stormtown's a perfect example where you have an alternate boss. You really don't get a lot from him, but he's there, he's along the way, but if you really choose, you could skip him. You know, So communication, not just about the fights, not just about what you can and can't do, but what you want to achieve also. And another thought I had was when you were referencing taking care of yourself. Come in there prepared. Have some healing pots for the middle of the fight. Oh, oops, but I don't want to tax my healer. Or, you know, some buff food if you're into the cooking or you've gotten some drop food. You got the housing plug where you get free food every day. You know, come in there and use your buffs. Everything counts, everything helps. You know, the more you are a team player but know how to take care of yourself, the better off it is for the whole.
Absolutely. All right, so I think we've kind of gone over just the basic concepts of the dungeons in this game. I mean, in essence, when you first look at it, it's really simple, but at the end of the day, when you put it into practice, it can be quite difficult, especially with a pug. So we're going to start off with just, our personal experiences, and we started going off on Stormtalon's Lair, but we just started going with, dungeons in general. So Stormtalon's Lair, again, one of the first dungeons you encounter when you get into the game at level 15. And then again, there is a veteran version at level 50, which again gets exponentially harder. Not just basic damage or increased health of your boss, but also the telegraphs change a little bit. But I found that when doing Stormtalon's Lair, again, I haven't done the regular mode in a while, so I'm just going to have to base my experiences on veteran, which again is still very similar, except there are minor differences in the bosses a little bit too. So, like for instance, when you're doing these side quests and whatnot, and especially when you're trying to get attuned at level 50, you have to do these. You can't skip them. You can't skip that side boss. You need him. Not only do you have to beat, not only do you need him, you got to do it within a specific time frame. So you can't wipe. You can wipe probably 2 times, maybe, before you realize that you're just out of time, and that's it. Again, there's a time limit. You have to do the secondary objectives. You have to do the boss, and you have to do it within a specific time frame. So again, if you want to move on to the next step of raiding, you have to look at these things and realize that you can't just do the bare minimum anymore. It's not possible. But on this, at the same token, if that's all you want to do, and that's fine too, just run through the dungeons and, grind it out. Maybe get some money at the end of it and, a couple little bit drops, but that's pretty much it. But that's how I looked at it, and I can honestly tell you that my first couple tries were incredibly difficult. Incredibly difficult. Just on regular mode. Atheros, I had no idea what to expect of this guy. Not a clue. Tornadoes? Oh, they're not going to do anything to me. Nope. Throw you into bolts of lightning. Death ensued. The guy explodes with massive AoEs around him. I'm like, oh? That was my first experiences with just the first boss. And I'm sorry, not the first boss, but with the second boss. And I honestly can tell you that, again, constant movement is key. And is emphasized, especially with this boss. What do you think about that guy?
Yeah, and what's neat about him is, both on regular and veteran, is it's not about just getting in there and beating his face and avoiding the telegrams. You have to do certain things at certain times. And it's knowing when to do the interrupt armor so you can maximize your damage, because you know that he's got a little bit of time before he's going to do this next thing that makes you just run for the woods, because you have to run for the woods. When you fight him, you can't just stay on him all the time because of the craziness that's going on. And using your interrupts at the wrong time, use it. Now it's time to hit him, but now you have to run away, is very frustrating. You have to beat him down in a certain way, or it's a very long fight. And like you said, on veteran, when you're against the clock, you don't want to sit there and waste a cycle to get back on him again. You just don't. Mm-hmm. So, picking off his little guys in a certain way and communicating that and getting in there and hitting him, having ranged hit both a little guy and him, however you're going to do it. You got to plan these things out. and I just love the fact that it's so movement oriented.
Oh, absolutely. And I know I just realized this. I skipped the first boss, and I apologize. I skipped, Bladewind the Invoker, so we'll get back to that guy. But just to continue with Ethros, multiple phases. They do continuously, they rotate again, especially once you get him to a certain amount of health. He dissipates, sends out little guys to come and beat you in the face. At that time, at least from my own personal experiences, when you want to save a lot of your interrupts, because they hit like trucks, but they also go down pretty quickly. And then again, after that, you're looking at getting pushed back, and then the tornado fees, and then again. But you can't blow all your interrupts either, because if you do and you get to him, you can't interrupt him, to actually pull off that extra damage from a moment of opportunity. So, these things keep changing, but you have to conserve, right? You have to know when. Look, I got 2 interrupts on my bar. I'll take care of this phase. You know what I mean? Save yours for the next one that's about to come up, and then work from there. So, the phase with the pushing back and the tornadoes, I can honestly tell you, there's a way you can sort of like gimp that a little bit in essence. Like if you really wanted to get gold from that and just completely avoid the tornadoes, you can have him actually, after each channel, come to you. You don't get hit by the tornadoes, or maneuver yourself around it, which is obviously the more difficult way, but also the more fun, at least for me. And it's probably one of the most movement intensive fights I've ever seen.
Yeah, the problem with waiting is, if I remember correctly, the longer you haven't hit him, the more something builds up, and the harder it is to knock about down. I don't remember if he heals up or he just gets a damage buff or whatever. So it's, unless you have a really strong DPS, not getting in there right away, dodging the tornadoes and hitting them quickly, could actually extend your fight also. So I don't exactly remember what that buff was, but
it's actually massive damage.
Yeah.
So you really don't want to get hit by that.
Yeah,
that's going to hurt.
So you got to get in there and get that stopped from building up, So, yeah.
I would honestly venture to say that that's probably the key in which you can't really wait. You can't. I mean, by the time you get to him, he's already at 50% channeling. So, again, I believe, if I remember correctly, you need 2 interrupts. I'm not 100% sure on him, 2 or 3, to get him down, and then you get your moment of opportunity, and then you just wail on him. And again, the cycle keeps flipping and it continues. So as soon as you get that down, it seems like he's actually not that bad, but it's like any other fight. If you slip up even a little bit, it's going to hurt.
Yeah, and the thing about the cycles, we need to be clear that the cycles don't always go in exactly the same order. In fact, they very seldom do. So you got to know that when you run up and you interrupt that massive damage, you got to be prepared for what comes next, because it's one of 5 different things he potentially could do. I don't know how many it is actually, but I'm just throwing a number out there that you have to be prepared for, because you might be able to just stand there and keep going, but you may have to interrupt and then get the heck out of the way, just depending on what he wants to do. So,
right. He's got a mind of his own.
Yeah, and that's the thing I love about the telegraphs too, is the telegraphs aren't always indicative of how you need to get out of the way. So you got to learn. If he projects a telegraph, that ability or whatever that's going across the screen might say it comes at you. The other one might say it's coming from behind you or on top of you. It's just telling you the area of danger, So you got to be prepared for that type of learning also, One telegraph you might be able to stay in and jump out at the last second. Another one, you just better move,
right. That is another thing that I almost forgot to emphasize is, while the aspect and understanding of telegraphs is almost very, it's almost very simple, the simple fact is that there's so many different types of telegraphs, like you mentioned. You don't know where they're coming from. Are they circular? Are they square? Which direction are they moving on? Are they on top of you? Do they only do damage when they fully expand out, or do they do damage continuously? That is where I think a lot of people tend to mess up, is not looking at it first and realizing, oh crap, I have a couple of seconds before this thing expands. Let's not waste a dodge until just before it does, and then the damage hits. So just wanted to backpedal and go over that, because there are many different types of telegraphs in this game, many, and to know them all.
Especially from a tank, where if the telegraph is one of those that starts at the outer ring and comes in, you can stay on top of him until the very last second, and then you pop out. But if it's coming right from him and has to go through you, well, you need to dodge out of the way. But as soon as it goes, starts its wave, you can jump right back in. It's all of those little nuances that affects every class and how they get out of that telegraph, and whether it's going to be effective and do super damage to you, or it's just going to be minimal. It just has to do with all the particulars, and every boss is different. Even out in the world, not in the dungeons, people just get complacent with, oh, it's a telegraph. It's coming at me. Well, no, some of those telegraphs come right out of the ground, and now you're rooted. And oh, by the way, that root is followed up by more damage of a different type. Right?
So they need to. It's definitely a lot. There's way more variety than what most people think. They're just a lot of people may be used to the just the slow telegraphs you see in open world, which introduce you to the telegraph system, which is fine. But again, that's significantly more emphasized in dungeons than anything else.
Well, and the crucial piece about being in the dungeon and having all those different telegraphs, you have limited room. A lot of those spaces, you have things that are around the room that will get in your way. Tiki torches, or, the prayer stands, or the beads, or the tables, and you're trying to tuck and roll, and all of a sudden you hit a solid piece of furniture, and you're like, oh, I wasn't aware of where I was standing. I should have tuck and rolled the other direction. And now, bam, you get hit by the whole thing.
And you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay for it significant. Possibly pay for it with even a wipe. Honestly, that's how bad it can hit you with.
Yeah, you tuck and roll the wrong way, and all of a sudden you get stuck in a stairwell, or
I've had that happen.
Barrel, and you're like trying to jump out of the way. And
honestly, at that point, I'm like, welp. Oh well.
Maybe I can hit my potion. Maybe it'll be just enough to keep me alive, but more than likely not.
No. All right, so let's go back to the second boss, or I'm sorry, the first boss, and I don't know why I keep saying second. It's the again, we have Blade Wind the Invoker. Again, this is the first boss you're going to encounter in Storm Talon's lair. It's a very interesting boss because at the beginning you don't really encounter him. You encounter 4 of his minions on the outside, which again have their own little interesting mechanic to them. You have to not only burst them down in a swift fashion, but every so often a small telegraph appears on one of your random party mates. And it was like what we were talking about before. It's one of those telegraphs. They don't do damage to you immediately, but what happens is it'll land on you, okay? But then it'll start to then the redness will start to expand outwards, and then when it fully expands, that's when it does damage. So understanding that, and then also that telegraph actually does a lot of damage to the enemy. So not only do you have to actually avoid that telegraph, you have to place it underneath the enemy and then quickly get out of the way just in the nick of time before you take damage. So there's a lot of interesting mechanics just from the first bout of this fight, and you have to do it 4 times. 4 times before you even have a chance to actually fight the main dude. Okay?
Yeah, and don't bring that telegraph to your party members instead of the bad guy.
So you got to keep it on the bad guys. You got to keep it on the minions on the outside, take them out, and then the boss opens up. But no, he doesn't just open up, okay? He has to actually get rid of your weapons. He has to disarm you. So now you got to go get your weapons, and then the guy has 3 interrupts armor. I think he has 3 interrupt armors, okay? And then he does a massive telegraph 3 times. Which allows for little snippets, little spots of you to get out of the way. Or if your group is actually coordinated enough, you can interrupt him and get a moment of opportunity to do continuous damage on top of avoiding that telegraph. But if you're just starting out, you're not going to know this, are you? No, you're actually going to see, holy crap, I have to get my weapon, but oh my goodness, he's channeling something. It's a massive telegraph, and there's only little boxes around him that are safe. And he does that 3 times before you can even do any damage.
Yeah.
So the mechanics just from this guy alone, will destroy you. And it hurts.
There's lots of little things in that room that you can get caught on. Lots of little stuff as you first come in, and they give you the opening story, him calling the minions up, and you're like, oh, this looks so cool. And then, oh yeah, let's just throw it all at you. 4 minions, all these telegraphs.
Absolutely. Oh, let's
walk from the door.
and let's not forget the wisps that spawn on the outwards that stun you if you stay inside them. They continuously rotate around the boss, and if you get hit by them, you better have a stun break, because I guarantee you that you're going to get hit by that. He's going to channel his telegraph, and you're just going to eat it. You're going to eat it. It's going to hurt, if not kill you, and then you're going to keep going from there. So you have telegraphs, you have wisps from those telegraphs that will. it's a cluster F of stuff that is coming at you. It's going to overwhelm you at first. After you've done it for a while, it actually isn't as bad, but you can still screw up. And if you screw up, you're still going to hurt. So this guy, again, his phases are very interesting. It goes from the telegraph phase of just massive giant telegraph with little snippets you can be safe from, to potentially interrupting him to get a moment of opportunity, to him disarming your group, to you avoiding wisps. And also that telegraph that goes on top of you that you did on the outside, that still happens. Yeah, so you have to avoid that too. So this boss is incredibly, you have to be mobile. Speed is the key, right?
And what's funny about all of this that we just described and just scared the pants off of everybody, he's the easiest boss in the dungeon.
Yes, he is. He's the first boss.
He's the first boss. The optional boss is actually probably the easiest boss in the dungeon.
Right.
He's not too bad. He's in the side tunnel on your way to the end. He's pretty simple. But he's got the lowest health. He's not really that complicated. It sounds like it is if you're paying attention. Mm-hmm. So, I don't want to scare everybody away. I don't want to try the dungeon. That made it sound so scary. No, it's not that bad. It's difficult. It's challenging. Extremely fun. But it's just getting you prepared for what comes next.
Mm-hmm. And it gets even harder. And more ridiculous. And more fun. So, all right. So that dude, again, he sort of prepares you for the second boss, which we've already discussed, the guy who throws out tornadoes at your face. Now again, what you have here, again, is just... I kind of wanted to go a little bit over the optional bosses, but again, they're not nearly as bad. They're just another... they have a little bit more health. They do a lot more damage, obviously, but it's just a matter of coordination of your interrupts and then taking advantage from there. So these optional bosses aren't exactly anything special. Don't get me wrong, though. If you miss, you're still going to hurt, but it's a little less mobile, but more focused on interrupts. So we're just going to leave those two at that, unless you had something that you wanted to add with those two.
No, I want to leave a little surprise for them. We can't give away all the secrets, so...
Yeah, you can. Sure.
Well, we could. We're not going to do one single shot.
No, absolutely not.
I do want to point out that as you're going through these dungeons, pay attention to the story, pay attention to the scenery. There's lots of little snippets and things you can pick up in there that is just... It's stimulating, it's enjoyable, it's fun. It leads to a whole thing. In fact, before you even come into Stormtown there, if you've been doing quests in the area, it all builds up to this. It's not like the dungeon is just a standalone event. So just point that out as we keep going.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Okay, so now we go on to the beauty of the dungeon, Stormtalon himself. Prior to fighting him, there's a little bit of a cutscene. I'm not going to give it away, but you'll experience it when you first do it. Really neat. Giant dragon, surprise, right? Comes at you. Couple things to note from here. He doesn't have too many phases. He's got a couple, but don't get me wrong, they're very painful. Obviously, your tank has to grab aggro, which again may be difficult if your DPS is already wailing on him from the beginning. Just understand this. Give your tank a couple of seconds to get a little bit of aggro and then go in. Just a little bit of a tip there. And then again, the most interesting thing about this guy is that you can't, unlike other bosses, you can't stay in front of him. He has a massively wide telegraph for his auto attack that constantly hammers the tank, so you got to stay on the side or the back. So now you have to avoid that. Secondly, what he does is he's got a couple of little, again, like you said, snippets that come at you. He's got things such as, as your boss is tanking it, random little AoEs are going to pop on the ground up below everybody. And your tank has to backpedal to keep you guys out of it while you're still potentially doing damage. And these AoEs, while relatively small, they spawn a ton of them constantly as you're moving. So you got to keep on moving. And then after that, he does a nice little knockback that stuns you, and then to the phase of instant death, to where a massive AoE converges on you. And if you guys do not interrupt that fast enough, your group will automatically wipe. So he may not be as ridiculously overwhelming visually in the beginning, but guarantee you that if you do not interrupt that, you do not coordinate your burst or your interrupt on top of that, that specific mechanic to where he's channeling, you can see it on the outside. You're going to see a massive red telegraph converge on you. If you don't stop that, your team will wipe and you'll have to restart. And that's just the beginning of the fight. That's pain.
Yeah, but you left out the surprise where it starts on the outside of the room and comes in, but it's basically under your feet if you don't start moving, because he throws you to the edge of the room and then you have to come back in. So it's not just it's on the edge of the room and, oh, I got plenty of time. Oh, no, he's throwing you out to the edge of the room, and now you got to get back to the center while avoiding other stuff while this thing is converging and interrupting. So much fun.
Isn't it? On top of lightning bolts coming on top of you, which is fun too. Which stun you, by the way, as you're converging on the boss to interrupt him. Now, if you're brave enough and you're actually coordinated enough to get past this part, he's got a nice little mechanic, which is really fun. This is one of the more fun mechanics I've ever seen. We'll randomly pick someone. He will, again, he will confuse this person. What I mean by confuse is that your movement keys will be jumbled up. And then he puts a circle around that person, and if you're standing outside that circle, it's a massive telegraph that does constant damage. And you can't stand in one spot either, because if you do, again, AoEs come on top of that one person consistently. So the person who gets targeted by this little circle has to constantly strafe around the boss so that the group mates don't get hit by these telegraphs. And then you guys, as team members, have to stay within it while doing damage. So it's a very interesting mechanic. It's something that you have to constantly be moving, but also don't go too fast, because you don't want to, you don't want your teammates to actually stay outside the circle. But it's one of the more fun mechanics that I've seen. And again, if it's even more difficult if you're the person he targets and you don't have a stun break and you can't figure out which key is left or right, but you got to spam it as quickly as possible and tell your team. That's a great mechanic, man.
Yeah, if you get lucky and that buff goes on the tank, life is usually pretty good. But when it's on a range that's way out on the edge of the circles and everybody's got to get off of Storm Talon, try and get inside that circle while avoiding the other telegraphs, because the stacking telegraphs, it's so much fun. It's crazy.
Oh, absolutely. And I guarantee you that those range are not rocking CC breaks, so they're not going to know which way to go. They're going to say I'm going left when in case they're going backwards, and we're all just laughing. So it's definitely a very, very fun mechanic, but it's one of those things that sort of has to keep you on your toes, because if you don't have a stun break, you need to figure out which one of your keys is going to go left or right, and just hammer on it as quickly as possible, so that your DPS and everyone else can stay within range, still do damage to the boss, and continue. Again, that's one of the more interesting telegraphs, and he sort of cycles through these phases consistently. Through between the instant death telegraph, to where he pushes you back, and you have to converge on him or else death ensues, to where he will drop little snippets of telegraphs underneath your feet that do a lot of damage. They won't kill you, but they still do a lot of damage, and if you don't move out of them, they will eventually destroy you. So this is a very, very mobile fight, in the simple fact that your tank's going to have to continuously backpedal to keep you out of these. One person who gets randomly targeted is going to have to continuously move while you stay in the circle. And by means, this circle gets exponentially smaller as you play veteran. The room for error is smaller. You can't screw up there. So this guy, again, he looks very intimidating as time goes on, and it is a beginner dungeon. He's not nearly as bad as it could be, but then again, if you're pugging, it's going to suck either way. But with a coordinated team, as long as you practice it, he really isn't that bad at all.
Always remembering all those telegraphs, and still don't stand in front of him.
Yeah, because again, massive cleave. Just to point this out, like I did it on veteran, and this is one of the first times I did it. I was dumb enough to stand in front of it, and I'm a warrior. Even though I'm DPS, I still have a decent amount of armor. I still got critted for 26k, just from the frontal AoE. I'm thinking, well then, all right, okay. Now I know exactly what I need to not do ever again.
Shake that off and keep on going.
Absolutely. Constant wiping and just keep on moving. So that is the end of the Storm Talon's Lair. Just a little overview of our experiences and what to look forward to or not look forward to, depending upon who you're talking to. Did you have anything else you wanted to add on top of this one?
No, just there are, if it's your first time on normal, once you kill Storm Talon's Lair, there's 3 pieces of lore in that room. I'm all about the story, so make sure you pick those up before you just run to get out of there. So.
All right. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Ruins of Kelvareth, the second dungeon that you have access to. one of the what I would consider, as well as Chief would probably consider to be the beginner dungeons, since you get access to them at a very early level. Now with this, I've noticed with this dungeon, you can actually skip a lot of the trash, like a lot. I've skipped a ton. In fact, the first boss you already encounter within the first couple of minutes, and then the second boss I've skipped like 90% of trash, and then I was able to get to them. So the trash themselves, nothing really special, just a matter of proper interrupts and then taking, moments of opportunity and working from there. So we'll move on to the first boss, Grond the Corpse Maker. This guy looks like a giant dog, honestly. Got a couple of little interesting mechanics attached to this dude, but nothing really crazy. So upon first entering this pit, it's really cool. It's like a gladiator's pit, and you have a bunch of traps around you. So he's already got a frontal AOE that you have to avoid, that the tank has to deal with. He has a couple of interesting mechanics. First of all, you have to avoid these traps, or else they keep you in place, and then you're already taking damage. But he's got a frontal and rear attack, conal attack, that he will do. So it's very important that you and your teammates stay upon the sides of them, and then DPS from there. He also has a charge attack, but mostly he just goes after the tank. Nothing really special with that one. One of the telegraphs that must be interrupted. Actually, the only telegraph that I noticed that has to be interrupted is Thrash. It's the telegraph. It's the little channel he does to where he does like a little bit of a back kick in a circle. It does actually a significant amount of damage, but also pushes you back. So again, saving your interrupts for that phase is key. But he does it very quickly, very quick channel. So it needs to be done just in quick succession, and then again taking advantage of that moment of opportunity, and then after that, again, he spawns little minions, I've noticed, that also need to be thrown into these traps, and again while DPSing him down. So he isn't exactly as intimidating as what I would consider to be like the first boss from Stormtalon's Lair, but by no means is he a pushover if it's your first time going through. Remember, coordination with your interrupts, especially with Thrash, the one that needs to be interrupted, is key. So that's from my experience. What do you think from that dude, huh?
Yeah, he's an interesting mechanic, and it's funny. I really like the Kilvarath character models. The Pumbas. Like this first guy is like a Pumbaa of Wildstar, big wild boar type thing, and the front and the back. He's spewing it from both ends. But the Kilvarath themselves, the whole artwork in here is just so stimulating in the way they did it, and it's really awesome. You come in here and you got to worry about this pit hound. Is basically the philosophy of what this guy is. And like you said, he's not as tough as the first boss in Stormtalon. It's kind of like they switched the first and the second boss as far as difficulty levels in the two dungeons, but as they're both the beginning dungeons. He's not bad, but you're right. Coordination, knowing when to interrupt is the key.
Mm-hmm. So. He tends to, again, cycle these over until he's dead. He's, again, nothing really too intimidating, but he still does a lot of damage, has a significant amount of health. So, again, knowing when to actually interrupt. And that's really what it comes down to, is just proper movement to stay out of these telegraphs, and knowing when to interrupt, and then cycling through it, and then you can finish him off. All right, so we are moving on to the next boss. This guy is actually interesting. I like this guy's name. His name is actually Slave Master Drock. This guy, you need a little bit of movement. You need a little bit of coordination, because again, this guy hurts. Just one giant dude just staring at you as you come through. And first, you got to take care of, like, you got, I believe, 3 groups on the outside. This has nothing to do with the boss itself, just the trash, and then you go and fight him. Again, you can. He's nothing really intimidating when you first get him, but he's got a, he starts to put like little telegraphs underneath players that it's relatively easy to avoid as long as you're constantly moving. Even still, you won't take too much damage from it, but it's still something that you don't want your healer to have to focus on. Especially if your tank is taking significant auto attack damage. So one of the more difficult phases he goes through is the enslaved probes. These telegraphs cover the entire room. The entire fight. I mean, the entire room of where you have to fight. So, again, you have to actually kill one of the enslaved probes to actually make a spot. So after you do a significant amount of damage to him, he'll go inside this green wall, which looks like the Matrix, and he'll start spewing out these probes that, again, coordination is key. You don't want your team to go randomly whacking a bunch of probes. You're not going to do enough damage. It's going to wipe the whole team. What they do is they expand out and they expand out very slowly, and then once they reach, the full range of outside, they do a massive amount of damage. So what you have to do is hammer down one of them, and then that will pretty much, allow you to stay safe and continue on with the fight. But again, coordination is key. If you don't do that, it literally is an instant wipe. There's nothing you can do. I've actually did that once to where I was just randomly whacked just one of them on the outside, which I shouldn't have. The whole team was dead because there wasn't enough damage on that one single probe. So coordination, man, and that's just the first. I mean, did you ever do that? Did you guys ever have to do that when you were going through it? I mean, did any randomly whack just random probes?
Yeah, I mean, your first inclination the first time you go through is, hey, all these probes, everybody take one. Mm-hmm. And you realize that didn't work.
Nope. Mm-mm.
And I remember the second time you go through, okay, well, put the 2 DPS on that and we'll keep tanking the boss. And I'm like, nope, that's not working either.
Nope.
And, this is one of these fights that really makes it apparent and important to make sure that you keep the healer between you and the tank, because this is a really important fight. The tank is going to be eating a lot, and you got to keep that tank's health up. And the healer, depending on the type of healer, doesn't have time to be worrying about how the DPS is taking damage. So, just throwing that out there, especially for the first phase. Those probes, or not the probes, but that first set of telegraphs does massive damage that he has to eat as a tank.
Mm-hmm. So. Yep. Oh yeah. Again, coordination. The probes. Again, after doing it a couple times, you realize just focus one of them down, and again, that first phase goes a lot more smooth, or it goes a lot smoother. All right. So the next phase he actually goes through is a very interesting one. It's especially if people are, if they understand and they've actually experienced tethering, being tethered down, which again was actually pretty cool. When I first got tethered, I was like, wow, so now I feel like a dog because I got this thing around my neck and it's holding me back, which is pretty funny, but still a very interesting mechanic. Once you get him to a specific amount of health, he'll teleport all the members on the outside and you all will be tethered. So now in this phase, again, it's very interesting because your tank and your healer have no DPS. So the DPS have to quickly get themselves out of it by destroying that anchor and then immediately assisting the healer and the tank, while also him putting out a suppression wave, which is a telegraph that will eventually cover the whole room. It's a very small, it's thin, but it's very wide. And it's one of those telegraphs that doesn't do damage initially, but as it charges up and fills up the whole bar, it does damage at the end. So it's something to where you can avoid very easily and then take advantage of the boss who's not doing any auto attack damage. So this one requires coordination more so from the DPS, because the healer and the tank aren't really going to be doing much except needing help to get away from unanchored is what I'm getting at. So this one, again, coordination from your DPS to quickly get themselves out and immediately getting you guys out, which again isn't really that bad. It doesn't require too much, especially with the telegraphs that coming at you are very small. So this phase I didn't think to be incredibly overwhelming, especially if you knew that as a DPS, I mean, for a fact your healer and tank aren't going to get out by themselves. So, I mean, but some people may not have encountered that, and it's something to consider. So understand it and take away from it that, help out everybody. Everybody's going to need assistance at one point or another. Your tank and healer needs assistance more than they're going to realize at this point. So during this phase, just, as a DPS, you are more important than your tank and healer, because without you during this phase, they can't go on. So be happy that you're a DPS for once, and then go from there. So that phase was interesting. I've encountered a couple phases during that where we kind of screwed up and didn't help our tank and healer, and then it was just a wipe. So I'm sure you've encountered the same thing, Chief. I mean, it's sort of very common, right? I mean, in a sense.
Yeah, and I really like the idea that they made it more important to be aware of your surroundings and helping each other than it was to just all-out charge on the boss. So many dungeons make it to where everything is about the boss, and how fast you can burn him down, how fast you can avoid his things. And this kind of fight makes you realize that not every fight is about a single thing. Even with lots of telegraphs, it's more important to avoid damage, get your healer out, not waste the healer's powers to re-heal you because you ate a telegraph to get them out, and getting back on the boss. Because like you said, the tank and the healer is going to have a little bit harder time getting out of those tethers, but you have to get them out. But you also don't want to take a ton of damage because now you've just made the rest of the fight harder because the healer's got to play catch-up. So it really comes down to that total awareness of what's the most important thing at that second. And that can change as you go. The faster you get out of the tethers, the faster you can do other stuff. But if you're stuck in tethers, then make sure you don't also take damage, type of thing. So
absolutely. Okay, so the next phase again, you're actually almost pretty much done with this boss if you can actually last that long. This one I found to be a little more interesting because he will again, everyone has to move away from the Matrix portal. It looks like the Matrix is this green stuff just going up and down, which is really funny to see. He'll target one player, and these giant sort of probes will then chase that player and then explode and do massive damage. So that one player has to sort of just run around constantly while everyone else is DPSing this, probe down. Again, this one isn't nearly as bad because it's not focusing on the whole group as it is one player, but it's very simple to understand that one player just needs to keep on moving. Don't even worry about DPS, just keep moving, let everyone else take care of those probes for you, and then you'll move on to the last phase, which is really just a simple tank and spank, and then he goes down. So I would honestly venture to say that the more difficult, the most intimidating part of this phase is probably the one where people don't realize to focus that one probe, which will instantly kill your whole team because they want to each of them target one and then go from there. So this guy isn't as intimidating, at least again from playing Storm Talon's Lair so many times, but he can be as long as your team doesn't realize constant movement, constantly helping your teammates, especially if you're playing DPS. And then again going from there, and again he's really not that intimidating, especially from a visual standpoint. Chief, did you want to add anything onto this boss before we continue on with the last one?
No, I think we covered him really well because we don't want to give away all the stuff. Or maybe we do.
No, we could. I mean...
No, that's okay. Move on.
Okay, and now we have the last one, Forge Master Trogan. This guy is actually pretty cool. He has one of the most interesting mechanics I've ever seen introduced into an MMO. And we'll get to it, but one of the mechanics that he starts off with a simple matter of, he's got his little forge, he starts to hammer on the forge, and, starts to spout AoEs everywhere. Very simple to avoid, nothing really intimidating. I mean, they spawn everywhere, but again, after they spawn, a lot of them tend to go away, which gives you a little more breathing room to continuously move. So he's not exactly the most intimidating, at least at the beginning. However, again, once he starts to come off from that phase and starts hammering on your DPS, you have to be aware that eventually what he's going to do is he's going to push everyone back a little bit. These little orbs are going to start spawning around him. And the whole goal of it is for you as teammates is to gather them for yourselves, right? Because if you start to give him the stacks, he starts to do more damage consistently in an AoE, which potentially will wipe you depending upon how many how many orbs he's gotten. But on the flip side, another positive reason why you want to gather these is because they give you a damage buff, which is really neat. So really cool to see, a little interesting mechanic that allows you to not only prevent the boss from doing more damage, but continuously pad your DPS if that's what you're into, which sometimes I'm into, and again continuously fight. Now the most interesting part of this fight that I find to be really cool is that after you get him down to a certain amount of health, he goes back to his forge, he jumps back. Most people tend to run to this guy. You don't want to do that. That's the last thing you need to do, because then he'll do a little phase which I call the bullet hell phase, which he starts to spawn out these little saw blades at you, which if any of you've ever played a bullet hell game, where you're the little ship, you got to avoid these little, these multiple little bullets. It's the same concept, exactly the same. So you have to constantly just move and try to avoid these small but multiple, saw blades coming at you, and then you go on to the next phase and continue, and it sort of just rotates from there. But that's the most interesting phase I've ever seen, because it literally feels like you're playing a bullet hell game. So how did you guys fare with your first encounter with that, Chief? Because I can honestly tell you, I probably wiped tons of times doing it.
Yeah, it was, you're not really expecting it. And like you said, the first inclination is, oh, he's going to do a new phase. We got to get in there and interrupt. And you're running up, and you don't have time to interrupt. And all of a sudden, I called it the bee swarm, where, you know, the hail of bullets, you know, and you're like, oh my gosh, I just got ripped to shreds. And you're trying to figure out, well, how do you avoid this? How do you continue to do stuff? And really, it's not a matter of both. You either do stuff or you avoid stuff. You're not going to have time and opportunity to really do both. And it was like, okay, everybody take a deep breath. When we get to this phase, let's just work on avoidance. We'll get to attack again in a minute, you know. So, yeah, really well done when they designed that, hey, let's switch things up tactic in the dungeon.
Absolutely. So. And again, this is probably the most movement-intensive fight, just because of that aspect alone, honestly.
Yeah.
Because you have very little room to move, but it behooves you to actually move farther away because it gives you a little more room. But even still, if you want the challenge and just go up a little more and try and actually dodge it, I find it to be a little more challenging, a little bit more fun. But again, not exactly the most intimidating when it comes to multiple different types of phases. But again, you know, gathering these orbs so he doesn't do massive AoE damage to you and your teammates, also giving you a damage buff, a nice little incentive. The bullet hell phase, you know, the tank and spank phase. It's not exactly the most intimidating, but again, by all means, don't take this boss lightly, because he will hammer you down, literally. You know, no pun intended, because he's got a hammer, but you know, he's probably one of the more fun bosses just from that little mechanic alone.
Well, and he's such a big guy, too. I mean, it's like, you look at him and he's just got this massive, massive hammer, like you said, and he's just intimidating to look at. And then he's got all this other stuff going on, because when you see him with a hammer, you're like, oh yeah, we're just going to tank and spank this guy through the whole thing.
Yeah. I want to see you do that. I want to see someone do that. If you can do that, I will buy you a drink. I promise. It'll be done. Okay. Did you want to add anything else into this dungeon before we cut it and then discuss upon the next podcast and what we'll be going over?
No, I think we covered it very well. I haven't seen any questions specific to the dungeons. I think they're just happy to listen to us. So.
Well, look at our ugly mugs.
Yeah, I've got my bum on the outside right now.
Oh, I can't grow that, man. I can't do it. My job won't let me. Maybe one day.
Well, wife's been out of country for a while, so I just, you know, I figured she'll come home and I'll finally shave.
Fair enough. All right, so we this week again we discussed the 2 beginner dungeons. You know, they're not labeled as beginner, but you might as well label them that, because they are the first dungeons you encounter. Stormtown's Lair, Ruins of Kelvareth. Next week we will be going over 2 other dungeons that 2 more dungeons that you will be encountering as well. And again, just stay tuned again. And we'll be going over more aspects of the game as we go on, such as, again, PvP. We'll be focusing on more of the classes in depth. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we have to literally focus on one class per podcast, because that's how in depth they can be. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you want to just tell everyone who you represent, Mr. Chief Sarkhan, the great chief himself, please, if you would.
So I'm Chief Sarkhan, as many of you know. I'm a streamer here on MMORPG.com. I also do articles for MMORPG.com and WildstarFans.net and Nexus Cribs.
Wait, you do Nexus Cribs?
Yes, I do.
Oh my goodness. I got to buy even more.
I'm also a guide writer for both Wildstar, and back in the day I used to do the Secret World guides. All my guides are up over on WildstarFans.net also. But within the spirit of this podcast and dungeons, I will throw a plug out there. Wildstar Fans got a little article about how these aren't going to be the introductory dungeons potentially in the future. Over on PTR, they're doing a test on a new dungeon that's going to get a level 10 version. So we'll just throw that plug in there for them for that. We won't talk about it because it's not even been tested yet, but it is in their plans. So hopefully in the future at level 10-ish, you'll get your feet wet on a new dungeon if you're getting new to the game. So anyway, but yeah, you can find me over on Twitter, Chief Sarkhan, Twitch, YouTube, all that fun stuff, and obviously here with sitting on the couch because I need all the psychiatric help I can get.
Oh goodness! Oh my gosh! You don't want that psychiatric help. Trust me, it's not exactly what you're looking for. But yeah, thank you again, Chief, for coming on, and I really, really appreciate it. I'm Arkin Bigheart. I represent Sitting on a Couch Gaming. I've been with them for a long time. And again, we'll continuously do this. And again, thank you, MMORPG.com, for allowing us to use your channel and help also promoting this game. So once again, we'll be back in 2 weeks to do another podcast. It will, again, more than likely, again, because we're going to finish off the dungeons and continuously figure that out and just, move on. And then we'll move on to more, potentially more class-oriented or PvP-oriented stuff, and we'll go from there. So thank you all again. You guys have a wonderful day, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.